Welcome, dear listener. You've arrived at a quiet place now. A place where the world slows, where the night grows gentle, and where you don't need to carry anything with you anymore. Take a slow breath. Let the day loosen its grip. You are safe here, and a story is waiting for you. On the fog-shrouded northern coast of Scotland in the late 1800s, an old lighthouse stands against the dark Atlantic waters, and within that lighthouse lives a man named Elias MacLeod, a keeper of light, of silence, and of long, solitary nights. Elias has tended this light for 32 years, long enough to know the moods of the sea, long enough to feel when the fog carries more than mist, long enough to sense that something ancient watches from beyond the beam, something without a name, something that remembers these shores before memory itself. This is not a story of fear. It is a story that moves like the tide, slow, steady, inevitable, a story meant to carry you gently toward sleep. Let the waves calm your thoughts. Let the turning light guide you inward. Close your eyes now. This is the watch of Elias MacLeod, and it begins now. The lighthouse and Elias's world. The lighthouse rose from the rocky promontory like a pale finger pointing toward heaven, its whitewashed stone tower catching whatever meager light the northern Scottish sky chose to offer. Elias MacLeod had climbed its spiral staircase so many thousands of times that his feet knew each worn step, each slight irregularity in the iron treads, each place where the curved wall pressed closer on the tight turn. 112 steps from the keeper's quarters at the base to the lantern room at the top. He had counted them on his first day, 32 years ago, and his body remembered that number even when his mind wandered to other things. The lighthouse had been built in 1863, one of the Northern Lighthouse Board's proudest achievements, designed by the same family of engineers who had given Scotland its chain of coastal beacons. The tower stood 78 feet tall, constructed from blocks of Aberdeen granite that had been ferried up the coast and wrestled into place by men whose names Elias sometimes found carved into the stone at the tower's base. The walls were 6 feet thick at the bottom, tapering to 3 at the top, built to withstand the worst storms that the Atlantic could hurl against them. And the Atlantic had tried. Oh, how it had tried. At the top of those 112 steps, enclosed in a room of glass and brass and iron, sat the heart of the lighthouse, the Fresnel lens. It was a magnificent piece of engineering, a third-order lens manufactured by Barbier and Fenestre in Paris, and installed the year the lighthouse was completed. The lens stood nearly 6 feet tall, composed of concentric rings of crystal-clear glass prisms arranged in a beehive shape, each precisely cut surface designed to capture the light from the oil lamp at its center and bend it, focus it, send it streaming out across the water in a beam that could be seen for 18 miles on a clear night. Elias had spent countless hours cleaning that lens, polishing each individual prism until it gleamed, ensuring that not a single mote of dust or drop of moisture dimmed its brilliance. He used soft chamois cloths and a special solution of spirits and water, working with the patient precision of a jeweler. The lens floated on a circular trough filled with mercury, that strange liquid metal that allowed the enormous apparatus to rotate smoothly on its pedestal. The mercury made the lens turn with an almost supernatural ease, though Elias knew to be careful around it, knew the warnings about the vapors, about the strange maladies that could afflict keepers who spent too much time in that enclosed space, breathing its invisible fumes. A clockwork mechanism, much like the works of an enormous pocket watch, controlled the rotation of the lens. Weights suspended on heavy chains hung down through the hollow center of the lighthouse tower, and as gravity pulled them downward, their descent was translated through a complex series of gears into the slow, steady rotation of the lens assembly. Every 2 hours through the night, Elias would climb those stairs again to wind the clockwork, turning the great hand crank that raised the weights back to the top of their travel. The lens would sweep its beam across the water in a precise pattern, a brilliant white flash every 10 seconds, a signature that mariners knew meant they were passing the Stornock Point light, that they should adjust their course to avoid the rocks that lurked beneath these waters like sleeping dragons. The lamp itself sat at the focal point of the lens, a brass and glass construction of elegant simplicity and maddening complexity. In these years, it burned colza oil, pressed from the seeds of a plant grown far to the south. The oil fed up through a wick that needed constant trimming, constant adjustment. Too long, and the flames smoked and blackened the glass. Too short, and the light dimmed. Elias had developed an almost instinctive sense for the wick, could tell by the color and movement of the flame when it needed attention, could adjust it to perfection in near darkness, using only the faint glow of the flame itself as his guide. Each evening, an hour before sunset, Elias would begin his ritual. First, he would inspect the lens, checking for any accumulation of moisture from the sea air, any smudges on the glass. Then he would fill the lamp's reservoir with oil, measuring it precisely, for he kept meticulous records of consumption and needed to know how many days of fuel remained before the next supply boat could attempt the treacherous approach to the lighthouse landing. He would trim the wick with small brass scissors, cut at a slight angle to produce the optimal flame shape. He would wind the clockwork mechanism, feeling the resistance of the heavy weights through the crank handle, counting the turns, 38 full rotations to bring the weights to the top of their travel. Then, as the sun touched the horizon, or where the horizon would be if the fog allowed him to see it, Elias would light the lamp. He used a spirit lamp to kindle the flame, bringing the small flickering light to the trimmed wick, and watching as the oil caught, as the flame grew, as it filled the reservoir of the lens with warm golden light. Within moments, that light was transformed. The prisms caught it, bent it, multiplied it, and sent it lancing out into the gathering darkness. Even inside the lantern room, surrounded by windows and light, Elias would have to squint against the brightness when the beam swept past his position. Out on the water, that light was hope. That light was safety. That light was the difference between finding harbor and finding the rocks. He would remain in the lantern room for half an hour after lighting the lamp, watching it carefully to ensure steady burning, to confirm that the lens rotated smoothly through its programmed cycle. Then he would descend those 112 steps, feeling his way more than seeing, for his eyes took time to readjust to darkness after the brilliance above. Down to his quarters, to the small rooms built into the base of the tower where generations of keepers had lived their isolated lives. The keepers' quarters were Spartan, but not uncomfortable. There was a small kitchen where Elias prepared his simple meals: porridge in the morning, bread and cheese at midday, fish when he could catch it, or salt beef from the stores when he could not. Potatoes and turnips from the garden plot he maintained on the sheltered side of the promontory. A sitting room with a chair by the coal stove, a small table, shelves lined with books that previous keepers had left behind, and that Elias had read and reread until he could recite whole passages from memory. A bedroom with a narrow bed, rough wool blankets, a single small window that looked out not toward the sea, but inland, toward the distant hills that were invisible most days behind their veil of mist. On the wall of his sitting room, Elias kept the logs and journals required by the Northern Lighthouse Board. Every day he recorded the weather, the sea conditions, the state of the light, the amount of oil consumed. He noted passing ships when he could see them, recorded any incidents, any maintenance performed, any supplies received. His handwriting had grown more cramped over the years, each letter formed with the careful precision of a man who knew these records would outlive him, that some future keeper or inspector would read his words and know that on this day, in this place, a man named Elias MacLeod had faithfully tended his light. Every 4 hours through the night, his pocket watch would wake him. He had trained himself to this rhythm as completely as any animal adapts to its environment. He would rise, pull on his wool coat and his oilskin outer layer, light his hand lantern, and climb. 112 steps in the dark, the sound of his breathing and his footsteps, and the ever-present whisper of the wind outside the tower walls. He would wind the clockwork, check the lamp, adjust the wick if needed, stand for a moment at the windows and look out into the darkness, into the fog, into the space where sea and sky merged into one. And it was during these night watches, these quiet vigils in the hours when the world seemed to hold its breath, that Elias first began to feel that he was not alone in his watching, that something was watching back. The northern Scottish coast. The lighthouse stood on Stornok Point, a finger of ancient rock that jutted into the North Atlantic like an accusation thrown at the sea. This was the northern coast of Scotland, where the land's last defenses against the ocean crumbled into a maze of cliffs and hidden reefs, where the water was never still and never quiet, where fog was as common as daylight and often more enduring. The geology here was old beyond the easy comprehension of human timescales. The rocks beneath Elias's feet had been formed hundreds of millions of years ago, had been ground beneath glaciers, had been lifted and folded and broken by forces that made the strongest storms seem like gentle exhalations. The coastline was a chaos of stone, black basalt columns that had once been molten rock cooling in the sea, gray granite, worn smooth by 10,000 years of waves, red sandstone strata that recorded ancient seas and ancient shores, now thrust up into the wind and spray. Between the larger formations, the sea had carved channels and grottos, had hollowed out caves that boomed and echoed with each surge of the tide, had created tide pools where strange creatures waited out the hours of exposure to air before the water returned to cover them once more. Seabirds nested in uncountable thousands along these cliffs, kittiwakes and fulmars, razor-bills and guillemots, puffins with their comical painted faces, shags and cormorants that sat on the rocks, with their wings spread wide to dry in whatever weak sun penetrated the mist. Their cries filled the air from before dawn until after dusk, a constant chorus that became so familiar that Elias only noticed it when something disturbed the rhythm. A predator passing over, a sudden gust of wind, some disturbance in their ancient patterns. The waters themselves were never the same color twice. On the rare clear days they might shine a brilliant blue-green, lit from above by sunshine, and from below by the white sand that lay in patches on the seafloor. More commonly, they were gray, sometimes a pale silvery gray that merged seamlessly with the sky, sometimes a dark slate gray that spoke of depth and cold and hidden currents. When storms approached, the water took on colors that had no comfortable names, shades of brown and green and purple that churned and mixed like bruises forming on living flesh. The North Atlantic current brought warmer water from distant seas to these shores, water that had begun its journey in the Gulf of Mexico and crossed thousands of miles of ocean to fetch up against Scotland's rocky ramparts. This current was what kept these northern lands habitable, what prevented them from freezing as solid as Labrador or Greenland at similar latitudes. But the current was also a highway for weather, bringing depressions that formed far to the west and tracked northeast across the ocean, bringing rain and wind and seas that could reach heights of 40 or 50 feet, waves that could shake even the lighthouse in its foundations. The tides here ran strong and complex, pulled by the moon through channels between islands and around headlands, creating currents and countercurrents that could confuse even experienced mariners. The tide pools that formed among the rocks were entire worlds unto themselves, and sometimes in the evening before lighting his lamp, Elias would crouch beside them and watch the creatures that lived there, sea anemones like living flowers, their tentacles waving in the water's gentle movements, tiny crabs scuttling between strands of kelp, fish no longer than his finger that somehow survived in these transient pools, hiding in the shadows of the rocks when the tide receded, waiting for the sea's return. But the most characteristic feature of this coast, the quality that defined it more than the rocks or the birds or the tides, was the fog. The Scots called it har, and it came from the sea, like something alive, like something with intention. The har formed when warmer, moister air from the south moved across the cold surface of the North Sea or the Atlantic, and the sudden cooling caused the water vapor in the air to condense into millions upon millions of tiny droplets that hung suspended, transforming the world into a realm of gray obscurity. The fog came in layers and currents, responding to winds and temperature gradients that Elias could not see but had learned to predict. Sometimes it lay low on the water, a blanket 2 or 3 feet thick through which the tops of waves protruded like dark fingers. Sometimes it reached from sea to sky, so thick that Elias could not see from the lighthouse door to the edge of the point, could barely see his own hand held at arm's length. The fog had texture, had weight, had presence. It left everything damp to the touch. It carried sounds in strange ways, sometimes amplifying the cry of a distant bird until it seemed to be calling from just overhead, sometimes muffling the crash of waves on the rocks until the world seemed wrapped in cotton wool. When the fog rolled in from the sea, which it did more days than not, it moved with an eerie deliberation. Elias would watch it from the lantern room, watch it advance across the water like a gray wall, would see the moment when it reached the base of the cliffs and began to climb. It moved up the rock faces like something living, like smoke rising, like ghosts ascending. It would reach the level of the lighthouse, would press against the windows of the lantern room, would reduce Elias's world to the small circle of golden light from his lamp, and the steadily turning lens that cut through the grayness in measured, rhythmic sweeps. In the fog, sounds changed. The fog horn, which Elias would activate during periods of low visibility, took on an almost physical quality, its deep moan seeming to push against the fog, to carve temporary tunnels of clearer air that would immediately fill in again. The bell that rang on the automatic signal buoy 3/4 of a mile to the northeast became a ghostly, directionless tolling that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Ship engines, when ships passed near enough, would become a throbbing vibration felt more than heard, a bass note that resonated in the chest and in the stones of the lighthouse itself. The lighthouse beam, when it swept through heavy fog, became a visible thing, a solid-seeming cone of light that seemed substantial enough to touch. Elias could stand in the lantern room and watch his beam lance out into the grayness, could see how the fog scattered the light, sent it back as a faint glow that made the entire sky seem to pulse with each rotation of the lens. Mariners called this effect the loom of the light, and it could sometimes be seen from farther away than the beam itself, a periodic brightening of the fog that told experienced sailors where to look for the lighthouse's characteristic flash. The seasons imposed their own rhythms on this landscape, though the changes were subtle compared to lands farther south. Summer brought longer days, though day and night became almost arbitrary terms when the fog persisted for weeks at a time. The sun would rise early and set late, but whether Elias ever saw it was a matter of chance and meteorology. Summer also brought the nesting season for the birds, and the cliffs would be so crowded with life that the very rocks seemed to pulse with it. The smell changed, too, the guano building up on the ledges until the whole promontory reeked of it, a sharp ammonia tang that the fog held close to the ground. Autumn brought storms. The depressions tracked in from the Atlantic, with increasing frequency and violence, bringing winds that could exceed 90 miles per hour, bringing seas that threw spray as high as the lantern room, bringing rain that fell not in drops, but in solid sheets, horizontal in the wind, finding every crack and crevice in the lighthouse's stones. During the worst storms, Elias would remain in the lantern room through the night, unwilling to risk the stairs when the whole tower swayed and creaked, watching his light continue to turn, continue to flash, marking this dangerous place for any ship desperate or unlucky enough to be caught out in such weather. Winter was dark and short and fierce. The sun, when it could be seen, traced a low arc across the southern sky, barely climbing above the horizon before beginning its descent. Night stretched from mid-afternoon until late morning, and in that darkness Elias's light became the only certain thing, the only fixed point in a world of black water and black sky and fog that somehow seemed even more oppressive in the dark. The cold in winter was not the brutal killing cold of more northern latitudes, thanks to the Gulf Stream's warming influence, but it was a penetrating, damp cold that worked its way into joints and bones, that made the coal stove in the keeper's quarters precious beyond gold. Spring brought changes so gradual that Elias sometimes felt he only noticed them in retrospect. The days began to lengthen again. The birds returned, or at least their numbers increased, as species that had wintered elsewhere came back to nest. The fog persisted, but its character changed, becoming lighter somehow, less oppressive, carrying hints of growth and renewal from the land. The garden plot, which Elias had protected through winter with straw and burlap, would begin to show green shoots, potatoes and turnips and a few herbs that somehow survived the salt spray and the thin, rocky soil. Through all these seasons, through all the variations of weather and light and fog, the sea remained. It was never still. Even on the calmest days, a long, slow swell rolled in from the Atlantic, the legacy of storms hundreds or thousands of miles away, the ocean's memory of winds that had long since passed. The water rose and fell against the rocks, with a rhythm that was almost but not quite regular, a pulse that matched no clock, but that measured out time nonetheless. Waves broke against the cliffs below the lighthouse in explosions of foam and spray, eroding the stone grain by grain, reshaping the coastline with a patience that made human time scales seem like the brief flicker of a match flame in the darkness. And always, in all weather, in all seasons, in fog, and in the rare clear periods between fogs, the sound of the water, the boom and crash of breakers on the outer rocks, the suck and gurgle of water flowing through the channels and caves, the hiss of spray on the wind, the trickling sound of rain running down the lighthouse walls, the sound of the sea was so constant, so pervasive, that it became the silence against which all other sounds were measured. It was in this landscape, this liminal space between land and sea, between light and darkness, between the solid certainty of stone and the fluid mystery of deep water, that Elias kept his watch. And it was here, in the long hours when fog transformed the familiar into the strange, that he began to sense something watching him from the sea. First, subtle observations. It began, as such things often do, with a feeling rather than a fact, a sense of presence, of attention, of being observed. Elias was no stranger to solitude. 32 years at Stornok Point had long since accustomed him to his own company. But this was different. This was not the absence of other people. This was something else, something he could not quite name, but could not quite dismiss. The first time he truly noticed it was on a night in late September, during one of his 2-hour clockwork winding sessions. He had climbed the stairs as he had done thousands of times before, had wound the mechanism, had checked the lamp. The fog that night was particularly thick, pressing against the windows of the lantern room like something trying to get in. The beam of the lighthouse cut through it in a cone of light that seemed almost solid, and as Elias watched that beam sweep through its rotation, he had the sudden, inexplicable conviction that something out in the fog was watching the light, not avoiding it, as ships would, not indifferent to it as the rocks were, but watching it, studying it, aware of it. The thought was absurd, of course. What could be out there in the fog? Seals, perhaps, floating on the surface, their dog-like faces turned toward the light. Birds. Though it was late for birds to be active, but the feeling persisted, grew stronger. Elias found himself staring out into the grayness, trying to penetrate it with his gaze, trying to see what watched him. He saw nothing, only fog, and the measured sweep of his light, and the occasional glimpse of wave tops when the beam dipped toward the water. But the feeling did not leave him. Over the following nights, he found himself paying more attention to these moments, these hours of darkness and fog and isolation. He began to notice small things that had always been there, but that he had never quite registered. The way the fog sometimes seemed to move against the prevailing wind, forming slow eddies and vortices that had no obvious cause. The way his light beam sometimes seemed to illuminate something at the very edge of its range. A suggestion of presence or movement or shape that vanished when he tried to focus on it directly. The way the sound of the waves sometimes carried an undertone he could not quite identify, a resonance that seemed to come from deeper water than the rocks he could see. One night, standing at the windows of the lantern room, he saw what he thought might be a ship's light far out on the water, a faint glow visible through gaps in the fog. He watched it for several minutes, noting its position, preparing to log it in his journal. But the light did not move as a ship's light should. It did not rise and fall with the waves. It did not maintain a steady course. Instead, it seemed to pulse, very slowly, like something breathing. And then it was gone, not extinguished gradually as a ship passing behind a fog bank, but simply gone, as instantly as if someone had closed a door. Elias stood for a long time after that, staring into the darkness, wondering what he had seen. A trick of his eyes, perhaps, straining in the darkness, creating patterns where none existed. A reflection of his own light somehow bounced back from the fog. But he had been keeping lighthouses for more than 3 decades, and he knew light, knew how it behaved, knew the difference between real illumination and optical illusion. What he had seen had been out there in the water, had been real in some sense, even if he could not explain it. He began to pay attention to his dreams, something he had not done in years. Sleep for a lighthouse keeper was a fragmented thing, broken into 2-hour segments by the demands of the clockwork, and dreams were usually brief, chaotic, unmemorable. But now he found that he was dreaming of the sea more frequently, dreaming of depths and currents and things moving far below the surface where light never reached. He dreamed of watching eyes, though he could never remember what the eyes looked like when he woke. Only the sensation of being observed, studied, known. During his daily routines, he found his attention drawn to the sea more frequently. He would pause while climbing the stairs, would stop at the small windows that were spaced at intervals up the tower, would look out to the water, searching for what? He did not know. Signs of presence, evidence of the watcher he now felt certain was there. He saw nothing out of the ordinary. Seals on the rocks, birds wheeling through the fog, the endless rise and fall of waves. But the feeling persisted, grew stronger with each passing day. The fog seemed to be part of it somehow. On clear days, which were rare but not unknown, the feeling of being watched diminished. The sea became just the sea, vast and powerful but ordinary, subject to the laws of wind and tide and gravity. But when the fog came in, when it pressed close around the lighthouse and reduced the world to a sphere of gray obscurity, no more than 100 yards across, then the feeling returned in force. Whatever watched him, whatever sensed his presence here on this point of rock, whatever tracked the sweep of his light through the darkness and the fog, it was connected somehow to the fog itself, moved with it, used it, perhaps was part of it in some way he could not comprehend. Elias was not a superstitious man by nature. Lighthouse keepers could not afford to be. The work required a practical, methodical approach, a willingness to trust in machinery and mathematics, and the repeatable behavior of physical systems. But he had also spent enough years in isolated places to know that human understanding had limits, that there were things in the world that did not fit neatly into the categories that science and reason provided. The sea was full of mysteries, always had been. The old keepers, the men who had tended lights, before steam and electricity and precise clockwork mechanisms, had spoken of such things. Strange lights on the water, sounds that came from no identifiable source, the feeling of presence, of being watched, of sharing the lonely vigil with something that existed just beyond the reach of human perception. He found himself touching the stones of the lighthouse more frequently, pressing his palm against the granite, as if seeking reassurance from its solidity, its mass, its resistance to the fog and the sea. The stones were old, quarried from even older rock, and they had absorbed something of this place over the decades they had stood here. Sometimes, with his hand pressed against the cool surface, Elias imagined he could feel a very faint vibration, a resonance that matched neither the wind nor the waves, but something deeper, older, more fundamental, the pulse of the earth itself, perhaps, or the distant rhythm of some vast, slow process that operated on time scales that made human history seem insignificant. The birds seemed to notice it too, whatever it was. Elias had always paid attention to the birds, had learned to read weather and sea conditions from their behavior, but now he noticed other patterns. Sometimes, usually in the hours just before dawn, the birds would fall silent all at once. The constant chorus of cries and calls would stop as abruptly as if someone had dropped a curtain of silence over the cliffs. The silence would last for several minutes, and during that time, the feeling of presence would grow almost overwhelming, would become so strong that Elias would find himself holding his breath, listening, waiting, though for what he could not say. Then as suddenly as it had stopped, the bird's song would resume, and the moment would pass, leaving only the memory and the question, what had made all those thousands of birds fall silent at once? He checked his logs from previous years, going back through the journals left by earlier keepers, looking for mentions of similar experiences. He found very little. Most keepers wrote in a strictly factual style, recording weather and light conditions, ships passing, supplies received, routine maintenance performed. But occasionally, very occasionally, he found a note that suggested others had felt what he now felt. A single sentence in a journal from 1876. Peculiar atmosphere this night. Fog uncommonly thick and the sea quiet despite strong wind further offshore. A margin note in the log from 1876. Peculiar atmosphere this night. Fog uncommonly thick and the sea quiet despite strong wind further offshore. 1882, written in a different hand, apparently by a keeper who had been temporarily assigned to the station. Something strange about this place, cannot quite say what. Perhaps it is only the isolation. These fragments reassured him, in an odd way. He was not going mad. He was not imagining things that had no basis in reality. Others had sensed it too, this presence, this watcher from the sea. They'd not known what to make of it any more than he did, had not been able to put it into words any better than he could. but they had felt it. Whatever watched from the fog was not new. It had been there before Elias arrived. It would be there after he left. One evening, just after lighting the lamp, Elias decided to test an idea. Instead of immediately descending to his quarters, as was his habit, he remained in the lantern room and deliberately turned his back to the windows, facing inward toward the center of the tower. He stood there for several minutes, not looking at the sea, not looking at the fog, just standing with his eyes closed, paying attention to his other senses, to the feelings that arose without the distraction of sight. The presence was still there. If anything, it felt stronger when he could not see, as if by removing the visual input, by refusing to search the fog for signs of the watcher, he had somehow made himself more perceptive to its existence. It was like feeling the sun on your face with your eyes closed, knowing without seeing that a vast source of light and heat had its attention turned toward you. Except this was not heat, but something cooler. Not light, but something darker. Not the sun, but something that existed in depths where the sun had never reached. Elias opened his eyes and turned back to face the windows. The fog pressed against the glass, and his beam cut through it in its endless rotation. He pressed his hand against the cold glass and spoke aloud, feeling slightly foolish but compelled nonetheless. "I know you're there," he said quietly. "I don't know what you are, but I know you're there." The fog swirled outside the window, moved by winds he could not feel from his protected position inside the lantern room. The beam swept past. The clockwork ticked. The lamp hissed softly. Nothing changed, and yet everything changed, because Elias had acknowledged it, had spoken the truth that he had been circling around for weeks. He was not alone here. Something shared this space with him, something that had been here long before the lighthouse, something that would remain long after the lighthouse crumbled into the sea. He descended the stairs to his quarters, with the feeling following him down like a physical presence. That night, lying in his narrow bed, listening to the wind and the waves, he felt more at peace than he had in weeks. The uncertainty, the questioning, the wondering if he was imagining things, all of that fell away. Whatever watched from the fog was real. He did not understand it, did not know what it wanted, or if it wanted anything at all, but it was real, and somehow, in accepting that reality, he found a strange comfort. He was the keeper of the light, but he was not the only guardian of this threshold between land and sea. Something older kept watch with him, maintained its own vigil, observed the boundary between the human world and the deep waters that lay beyond. Outside, the fog pressed close around the lighthouse, and far out in the darkness beyond the reach of his light, something ancient turned its attention to the beam that swept across the waters, marking time, maintaining its rhythm, its eternal dance with the darkness and the deep. Elias's memories and past. Elias had not always been an old man keeping a lonely lighthouse on Scotland's northern coast. There had been a time, decades ago, when he was young and newly married, when the isolation of lighthouse keeping had seemed romantic, rather than oppressive, when the idea of tending a light had carried connotations of heroism and purpose, rather than merely duty. He had grown up in a fishing village on the Firth of Forth, the son of a fisherman and grandson of a fisherman, and by all rights should have followed them into that profession. But young Elias had been drawn, not to the taking of fish, but to the guiding of ships, not to the harvest of the sea, but to its navigation. He had watched the lighthouses along the coast and had marveled at them, at the way they stood defiant against storm and tide, at the way their lights cut through the darkness and the fog, at the way they represented humanity's refusal to surrender to the chaos of the natural world. At 20, he had applied to the Northern Lighthouse Board for a position as an assistant keeper. The board, always in need of reliable men willing to staff the remote stations, had accepted him after a brief training period in Edinburgh. He learned the mechanics of lamps and lenses, the chemistry of oils and wicks, the mathematics of focal points and beam angles. He learned about fog signals and clockwork mechanisms, about meteorology and tidal calculations, about the hundreds of small details that went into keeping a light reliably burning night after night, year after year. His first posting had been to a small lighthouse on a rocky island in the Inner Hebrides, a station that required 3 keepers working in rotation. The senior keeper there was a man named Angus Macduff, 60 years old and tough as the rocks they stood upon, who had been tending lights since before Elias was born. Angus taught him the things the board's training had not covered: how to read the sea, how to predict weather from subtle signs in the sky and the behavior of birds, how to pace yourself through the long nights, how to maintain mental stability through months of isolation and routine. "The light doesn't care about your moods," Angus had told him during one of their night watches together. "The light burns or it doesn't. Your job is to make sure it burns, no matter what else is happening in the world or in your head. Ships depend on it. Lives depend on it. You can't let personal matters interfere with that duty." Elias had taken those words to heart. He had dedicated himself to becoming the best keeper he could be, learning every aspect of the work, volunteering for the difficult shifts, maintaining the equipment with a precision that bordered on obsessive. After 3 years as an assistant keeper, he had been promoted to principal keeper and given his own station, a smaller lighthouse on the west coast that required only 1 man. It was there, at his first solo posting, that he had truly begun to understand what lighthouse keeping meant. The isolation was profound. Supplies came once a month if weather permitted, sometimes less frequently during winter. He could go weeks without seeing another human face, without hearing another voice. The only reliable company was the sea and the light and his own thoughts, cycling through their endless patterns like the beam of his lens. Some men broke under that isolation. Elias had heard the stories, passed around among keepers like cautionary tales. Men who had gone mad from the loneliness, who had abandoned their posts, who had walked into the sea one morning and never come back. Men who had let their lights go out during crucial hours, leading to shipwrecks and deaths. Men who had become so strange, so disconnected from ordinary human society, that they could never successfully reintegrate when their terms of service ended. But Elias had not broken. He had adapted. He had found routines and rhythms that sustained him. He had learned to appreciate the solitude, to see it not as absence but as a different kind of presence. The sea was company, in its way. The birds were company. The light itself was company, a living thing that required care and attention, that rewarded diligence with its steady burning, that connected him to the invisible network of mariners who depended on his vigilance. He had met Catherine during one of his brief shore leaves, a rare 2-week period when a replacement keeper took over his station and Elias returned to the mainland. She was the daughter of a shopkeeper in the coastal town where the Lighthouse Board had its regional office. They had encountered each other by chance when Elias stopped in her father's shop to purchase new books. Reading material was precious to keepers, and Elias had run through his small library multiple times during his months alone. Catherine had been behind the counter that day, helping her father with the accounts. She had looked up when Elias entered, and he had been struck by her eyes, clear and gray like the sea on an overcast day. They had talked while he browsed the limited selection of books. She had asked about his work, and he had found himself telling her about the lighthouse, about the isolation and the responsibility, about the satisfaction of maintaining something so essential. Most people found lighthouse keeping either romantic in a vague, ill-defined way, or simply incomprehensible. Why would anyone choose such isolation? But Catherine had understood, or at least she had tried to understand, and that effort had meant everything to Elias. They had courted, if you could call it that, through letters. Elias would write long, detailed accounts of his days, and Catherine would respond with news from the town, observations about the world that Elias was separated from. The correspondence had lasted for nearly a year before Elias proposed, and when she accepted, he had felt a joy tempered by the knowledge that he was asking her to share his isolation, to give up the certainties and comforts of town life for the uncertainties of a keeper's existence. They had married in a small ceremony, attended by her family and a few of Elias's colleagues from the lighthouse service. The Northern Lighthouse Board had granted him a transfer to a family station, a lighthouse large enough to house a keeper and his wife, with a small community nearby where Catherine could have some social contact. For 5 years they had lived together at that station, on a headland overlooking the Minch. Those had been the happiest years of Elias's life. Catherine had adapted to the life remarkably well. She had maintained a garden, had befriended the wives of fishermen in the nearby village, had created a home in the keeper's quarters that felt warm and lived in, despite the constant sound of wind and waves. She had even learned to help with some of the lighter lighthouse duties, had assisted Elias with cleaning and polishing, had kept the logs when he was ill with a fever one winter, had proven herself as reliable and dedicated as any keeper the board employed. They had hoped for children but had been disappointed. Year after year passed without Catherine conceiving, and gradually they had accepted that children would not be part of their lives. It was perhaps for the best, Elias had told himself. Lighthouse keeping was no life for children, with its isolation and its dangers, its lack of playmates and proper schools. But he knew Catherine mourned the children they would never have, and he mourned with her, even as they found contentment in each other's company. The winter that Catherine died had been particularly harsh. The storms had come, one after another, each one seeming to build on the fury of the last, battering the coast with winds that exceeded anything in Elias's experience. The seas had been mountainous, waves as tall as the lighthouse itself, crashing against the rocks, spray reaching all the way to the lantern room. For days at a time, they had been trapped inside. unable to venture out even to check the fog signal or tend to the garden. Catherine had complained of feeling unwell, but at first they had both dismissed it as simple exhaustion from the stress of the storms, from being cooped up inside for so long. But then she had developed a fever, and the fever had worsened, and Elias had realized with growing horror that this was not simple fatigue, but something serious, something that required medical attention. He had signaled for help using the emergency flags, but no boat could approach in such weather. He had done everything he knew to do, had kept her warm, had given her water, had prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. But the fever had not broken. For 3 days, Catherine had burned with a heat that seemed impossible, had tossed in delirium, had spoken words that made no sense. And on the 4th day, in the gray hours before dawn, with the wind still howling and the waves still crashing and the light still turning overhead, she had died in their bed, leaving Elias alone in a way he had never been alone before. The storm had broken the morning after she died. The wind had fallen, the seas had calmed, and by afternoon a boat had been able to reach the lighthouse. They had taken Catherine's body, wrapped in a blanket, back to the town for burial. Elias had followed a week later, after a replacement keeper had arrived, and had stood at her graveside, while a minister spoke words about God's mercy and eternal rest that had seemed like empty sounds, meaningless syllables spoken into the wind. He had requested a transfer after that. He could not remain at the station where Catherine had died, where every room held memories of her, where her absence was a physical presence more real than any living person could be. The board had granted his request and had eventually assigned him to Stornock Point, one of their most isolated stations, a posting that many keepers tried to avoid. Elias had accepted gratefully. He wanted isolation now, wanted to be far from people and their sympathy and their well-meaning but useless words, wanted to lose himself in work and routine, wanted to become simply the keeper, nothing more, a function rather than a person. That had been 32 years ago. 32 years of tending the Stornock Point light, of climbing those 112 steps, of polishing the lens and trimming the wick and winding the clockwork. 32 years of fog and storms and the endless rhythm of the waves. 32 years of solitude, broken only by the monthly supply boat and the occasional visit from a lighthouse board inspector. He had grown old here. The hair that had been brown when he arrived had turned gray, and then white. The face that looked back at him from the small mirror in his quarters had developed lines and creases that mapped decades of wind and sun and salt spray. His hands, which had once been smooth and strong, had become gnarled and spotted with age, though they remained steady enough for the precise work that the lighthouse demanded. He had thought, during those early years after Catherine's death, that he might eventually request another transfer, might return to a station closer to civilization, might even retire from the service altogether. But he had stayed. Year after year, he had stayed. The isolation that he had sought as a refuge had become comfortable, had become home. He had adapted to it so completely that he could not imagine living any other way. The memories of his earlier life had faded, not into nothing but into a soft-edged distance like looking at the mainland through fog. He could remember Catherine's face, but it took effort now, a deliberate summoning of images that had once been immediate and present. He could remember the sound of her voice, but it had become mixed with other sounds, the wind, the waves, the birds, until he was no longer entirely sure which memories were real and which were reconstructions, wishes, dreams. He thought of Angus MacDuff sometimes, the old Khyber who had trained him so many years ago. Angus had told him once during a particularly long night watch about something he called lighthouse time. It was different from ordinary time, Angus had said. It operated on different scales, moved in different patterns. A day at a lighthouse could feel like a week or like an hour, depending on nothing you could identify. A year could pass in what seemed like a moment, or could stretch out into something that felt infinite. You lost track of ordinary time, Angus had said. You stopped counting days and started counting light cycles, tide cycles, the rotation of seasons marked by bird migrations and storm patterns rather than by calendars. Elias understood that now in a way he had not when Angus first explained it. He had lost track of ordinary time years ago. He knew the date, of course. He recorded it every day in his logs, but the dates had become mere notations, marks on paper that bore no relationship to his lived experience. Time for him was measured in the turning of the lens, in the twice-daily winding of the clockwork, in the weekly cleaning of the glass, in the monthly arrival of supplies, in the yearly cycle of seasons that were distinguished more by the behavior of birds and the character of fogs than by changes in temperature. There were moments, usually late at night when the fog was thick and the clockwork ticked its steady rhythm and the beam swept endlessly through its cycle, when Elias felt as if he had always been here, as if his earlier life had been something that had happened to someone else, a story he had been told but not lived. The young man who had married Catherine, who had hoped for children, who had thought about the future in terms of plans and ambitions. That person seemed impossibly distant, a stranger whose choices had led, through a chain of causation that now seemed inevitable, to this moment, this place, this solitary vigil. And yet, paradoxically, there were other moments when his past felt intensely present. He would be climbing the stairs, and suddenly he would remember with perfect clarity the first time he had climbed the stairs of a lighthouse. The mixture of excitement and nervousness he had felt, the sense of beginning something important. He would be polishing the lens, and he would remember Catherine standing beside him, helping with the work, her presence making the task seem less like labor and more like partnership. He would be looking out at the fog, and he would remember standing at the rail of the boat that had brought him to this posting, looking at the lighthouse from the water, seeing it as mariners saw it, a beacon of safety and certainty in a dangerous, uncertain world. These memories did not make him sad, exactly. They were simply part of who he was, part of the long accumulation of experiences that had shaped him into the old keeper who now stood watch at Stornok Point. They informed his understanding of the lighthouse, of the sea, of the duty he had undertaken. They reminded him why the work mattered, why the light could never be allowed to fail, why his vigilance had to remain constant despite the isolation and the monotony and the slow, steady erosion of his body by age and time. And now, in his 73rd year, having kept this light for longer than many keepers served in their entire careers, having become as much a part of this place as the rocks and the birds and the fog, Elias was being asked to accept something new into his understanding, to accommodate a presence that challenged his careful, rational approach to the world. The watcher from the sea did not fit into his framework of weather and tides and mechanical systems. It was not something that could be explained by science or predicted by experience. It simply was, had always been, would always be. Perhaps, Elias thought, this was why the Watcher had revealed itself to him now, in his old age, after decades of service. Perhaps you had to become fully part of this place, had to surrender your connection to the ordinary human world so completely that you operated on lighthouse time, on tidal time, on geological time, before you could perceive what had always been there, waiting in the fog and the deep water, watching the lights that humans built on their ancient shores, observing with an attention that was neither hostile nor friendly, but simply eternal, timeless, ongoing. Elias stood at the window of the lantern room, his hand resting on the brass railing that ran around the platform, and looked out into the fog. Somewhere out there in the grayness, beyond the reach of his light but always aware of it, the presence watched and waited, and Elias watched back, an old man at the end of his life's work, acknowledging a mystery he would never fully understand, accepting a truth that had no place in the logs and ledgers and official records that documented his service. The clockwork ticked, the lens turned, the light swept across the water, and in the fog, something ancient took note of the old keeper's acceptance, his recognition, his surrender to the truth that some watchers keep vigils that last far longer than a human lifetime, far longer than the standing of any lighthouse, far longer than the memory of the civilization that built them. The ancient presence revealed. To understand what watched from the sea, you would have to understand time in a way that human minds struggle to comprehend. You would have to think in periods measured not in years or centuries, but in epochs, in the rise and fall of mountain ranges, in the advance and retreat of ice sheets that covered half the world, in the slow drift of continents across the face of the planet. The presence that Elias sensed had existed before. Scotland was Scotland, before the rocks beneath his lighthouse had been thrust up from ancient seabeds and carved by glaciers and weathered by millions of years of wind and rain. It had existed when these latitudes had been tropical seas, when strange creatures unlike anything alive today had swum through warm waters that covered what would eventually become dry land. It had existed through the frozen ages when ice a mile thick had crushed and shaped the landscape, when the sea level had been hundreds of feet lower and the coastline had been miles away from where it was now. The ancient cultures that had eventually come to these islands had sensed it in their way. The Picts, those mysterious people who had carved strange symbols into standing stones, and whose language had been lost when they vanished into history, had known that something old lived in the water. They had left marks on coastal rocks, spirals and crescents and patterns that might have been maps or warnings or attempts to communicate with something that predated their own ancient heritage. The Celts who came later had woven the presence into their mythology, had given it partial names and attributes, though none of the names quite fit, and none of the attributes quite captured what it was. They spoke of creatures in the deep, of things that lived in the boundary places between sea and shore, of beings that were neither gods nor monsters, but something older than both concepts. The Nukalavi, The blue men of the Minch, the Selkies and the Kelpies, all these were attempts to describe something that resisted description, to categorize something that existed outside the categories that human minds created to make sense of the world. The Vikings, when they came raiding and eventually settling, brought their own myths. They spoke of Jörmungandr, the world serpent that encircled the earth, of creatures in the deep that predated even the gods. But these too were approximations, stories told to children and strangers, ways of pointing toward a truth that could not be directly expressed. The presence was not a serpent. It was not a god. It was not even a single entity in the way that humans understood individuality. It was something else, something that human language had no proper words for. It was, perhaps, most accurately understood not as a being, but as an awareness. It was consciousness without body, attention without eyes, memory without brain. It existed in the water and the fog, in the deep currents that circled the globe, in the slow grinding of tectonic plates, in the electromagnetic fields that permeated the earth, in the quantum foam that underlay reality itself. It was distributed, diffuse, omnipresent in these waters, yet nowhere specifically located. It was the ocean becoming aware of itself, the planet's own consciousness observing the strange new things that had appeared on its surface. Land, air, life, and finally, these tool-using creatures who built lights to push back the darkness. The presence had watched the rise of life in the seas, had observed as single-celled organisms multiplied and evolved, and eventually gave rise to the bewildering complexity of multicellular life. It had watched fish develop and diversify, had seen the first creatures crawl onto land, had noted the appearance and disappearance of countless species across hundreds of millions of years. It had watched continents merge and separate, had felt the impacts of asteroids and the eruptions of volcanoes, had experienced ice ages and warming periods in an endless cycle of change. Through all of this, it had been present but not active, aware but not acting. It simply observed, accumulated experience, existed as a witness to the vast, slow changes that shaped the world. It had no needs, no desires, no goals in the way that living creatures did. It did not eat, or reproduce, or die. It simply was, had always been, would always be, long after the sun burned out and the earth froze in the darkness of space. But it was not entirely passive. It responded to certain things, was drawn to certain phenomena. Light was one of them. The presence was aware of light in a way that was fundamental and immediate. The sun had been the original and greatest source, its daily rise and fall, creating the basic rhythm that governed so much of life on Earth. The moon reflected light across the water, creating patterns and paths that the presence tracked with the same attention that it gave to currents and tides. And then, recently in the presence's perception, though it had been centuries in human terms, new lights had begun to appear along the coasts. Small lights at first, fires built by humans to warn ships away from rocks. Then larger, more permanent lights, lighthouses, structures built specifically to project light across the water, to create artificial stars that burned through the night and fog, that marked the boundaries between safe passage and dangerous rocks. The presence had been drawn to these lights. They were different from natural light, had a quality of intention behind them, of purpose, of care. They represented something new in the presence's vast experience. Consciousness. deliberately creating light for the benefit of other consciousness. The lights were tools, yes, but they were more than that. They were gifts. They were statements of solidarity between creatures who navigated the dangerous boundary between land and sea. They were, in their way, acts of love. The Stornok Point light had appeared. How long ago? 62 years in human terms. A moment, less than a moment in the Presence's experience. But it was a bright moment, a clear moment. The lighthouse was particularly well placed, particularly well maintained, particularly bright. Its beam cut through the fog with reliable precision. Its pattern was consistent. Its character was distinct. Ship after ship had passed safely because of this light, had avoided the rocks, had found their way to harbor, or continued on their journeys. And the Presence had watched, had paid attention to this light more carefully than it had to others, had become aware not just of the light itself, but of the consciousness that tended it. The keepers who climbed the stairs and wound the clockwork and polished the lens, the Presence sensed them, felt their dedication, recognized in them something that resonated with its own nature. They too were watchers. They too maintained a vigil. They too existed in the liminal space between sea and land, between darkness and light, between isolation and connection. Over the decades, many keepers had served at Stornok Point. The Presence had been aware of them all, had sensed their individual characters, their strengths and weaknesses, their dedication or lack thereof. Some had been merely adequate, had done their duty without passion or deep understanding. Others had been exceptional, had brought to the work a level of care and attention that went beyond mere duty. But none had sensed the Presence in return. None had become aware that their vigil was shared, that something older than the lighthouse itself watched with them. Until Elias. Something in the old keeper was different. Perhaps it was his age, his long years of service, his deep familiarity with this place. Perhaps it was his solitude, the way he had withdrawn so completely from the human world that he had become attuned to other forms of being, other modes of awareness. Perhaps it was simply that the time was right, that after decades of watching, the Presence had decided, if decided was even the right word for what happened when a distributed consciousness shifted its attention in a particular way to make itself known. The process had been gradual. The Presence did not communicate the way humans did, through words and symbols and logical structures. It communicated through feeling, through the subtle manipulation of fog and current, through the ways it could influence the probability of certain coincidences. A light glimpsed on the water that might have been anything or nothing, a particular quality to the fog that suggested presence without confirming it. The silence of birds at moments when some deep recognition passed between the Presence and the keeper, who stood watch in his glass room, high above the rocks. And Elias had responded. He had noticed. He had paid attention. He had, in his quiet, methodical way, acknowledged that something was there, had accepted it without trying to explain it away or rationalize it into something safer and more comprehensible. That acceptance had mattered to the Presence, had mattered in ways that were difficult to translate into human terms, but that were nonetheless real and significant. The Presence had no concept of loneliness as humans experienced it, but it had something analogous, a sense of existing in isolation despite being everywhere, a paradox of being completely connected to everything but truly known by nothing. The Earth was alive in ways that human science was only beginning to understand, had systems and cycles and patterns that constituted a kind of planetary consciousness. But that consciousness was so vast, so slow, so different from anything humans would recognize as awareness, that it might as well have been unconscious from any practical perspective. But now, through Elias, through this old keeper who had given his life to maintaining a light on these ancient shores, the presence had found something like contact, something like recognition, not communication exactly, but acknowledgement. The cupper knew it was there. The cupper accepted its existence. The cupper continued his work not in ignorance but in awareness, maintaining his light not just for the ships, but as a kind of offering, a gift of illumination presented to the darkness and the deep. This mattered to the presence. It changed something fundamental about the nature of the watching, transformed it from pure observation to something more reciprocal, more interactive, more akin to the kind of relationship that gave meaning to consciousness. The presence would never speak to Elias in words, would never explain itself or reveal its history or share its vast accumulation of experience. But it would continue to watch, to pay attention, to be present in a way that Elias could sense, to maintain its own vigil alongside the keeper's vigil, to create through their parallel watching a connection that bridged the gap between human and something so far beyond human that the difference almost erased the possibility of connection. Almost, but not quite, because here, in this fog-bound lighthouse on Scotland's northern coast, in the measured rhythm of a beam sweeping across the water, in the patient dedication of an old man who climbed stairs and tended machinery and maintained his light despite the isolation and the difficulty and the slow erosion of age, a bridge had been built. It was a narrow bridge, a fragile bridge, a bridge that existed more in implication than in substance. But it was real, and it mattered, and it would endure for as long as Elias kept his watch, and the presence kept its own. The light swept across the water. The fog pressed close, and in that fog, in the deep water beneath it, in the electromagnetic fields that permeated the stone and the sea, in the quantum uncertainty that underlay all material existence, something ancient paid attention, recognized, acknowledged, and in its own way, honored the old keeper who had learned to sense its existence. Elias did not need to understand the full nature of what watched him. He never would, could never understand it given the limitations of human perception and cognition, but he understood enough. He understood that he was not alone, that his vigil mattered not just to the ships that depended on his light, but to something far older, something that had watched these shores change and evolve through countless generations, something that would watch long after the lighthouse crumbled, and the very rocks it stood upon were worn away by time and tide. That understanding was enough, more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. The rhythm of days and the watching presence. With the acknowledgement made, with the presence accepted, Elias's daily routine did not change in its externals, but was transformed in its meaning. He still rose at the same hours. still climbed the stairs according to the same schedule, still performed the same tasks in the same sequence. But now, each action was performed with an awareness that it was being observed, witnessed, recognized by something that gave those actions a significance beyond mere function. He began his mornings, as he always had, by extinguishing the lighthouse lamp shortly after sunrise. Even on foggy mornings, when the sun was invisible behind its veil of gray, there was a quality to the light that changed, a subtle brightening that told him dawn had come. He would climb the stairs to the lantern room, would carefully throttle back the oil flow to the lamp, would watch the flame dwindle and die. Then would come the ritual of cleaning, wiping down the glass chimney that surrounded the lamp, checking the wick for char, cleaning any soot or residue from the brass reflector that sat behind the lamp. The lens received its cleaning in the early morning as well, though the full polish was reserved for once a week. Each day, Elias would wipe down the prisms with a soft cloth, would remove any moisture that had accumulated during the night, would check for any signs of degradation or damage. His movements were practiced, efficient, the result of thousands of repetitions over decades. But now, as his hands moved across the glass, as he checked each surface for clarity and cleanliness, he felt the presence observing not just him, but the task itself. The care he took, the precision he maintained. Breakfast followed, a simple meal usually consisting of porridge or bread, sometimes an egg, if the hens he kept in their small coop had been productive. He ate at the small table in his quarters, usually reading while he ate, not the logs or technical manuals, but one of his collection of books, works he had read so many times that he practically had them memorized. Poetry, mostly. Wordsworth and Burns, Tennyson and Keats. The rhythms of their verses matched something in the rhythm of the sea, the measured cadence of waves breaking on rocks, the pulse of tides that govern so much of life on this coast. After breakfast came the daily inspection. Elias would walk the perimeter of the lighthouse, would check the foundations for any signs of erosion or settling, would examine the exterior walls for cracks or damage, would ensure that the rain gutters were clear and the drainage systems were functioning. He would check the oil stores, would verify that the sealed containers showed no signs of leakage or degradation. He would test the fog signal, that deep horn that bellowed its warning when visibility dropped below certain thresholds. He would inspect the small dock where the supply boat tied up, would check the mooring chains and the wooden planks, would make note of any maintenance that needed to be performed. This inspection took him around the entire property, and during it, he was always aware of the sea. It was impossible not to be aware of it given its proximity and constant presence, but now his awareness had a different quality. He found himself pausing more frequently, standing at the edge of the point and looking out at the water, trying to sense the presence that he knew was there. Sometimes he felt it strongly, almost as a physical pressure in his chest, a weight of attention that pressed against him, like the fog itself. Other times it was barely perceptible, a faint suggestion at the very edge of awareness, like a sound heard from a great distance. The tides fascinated him more than they ever had. He'd always paid attention to them, of course. Any keeper had to, given how they affected supply deliveries and maintenance schedules. But now he watched them with a new intensity. The water rose and fell according to patterns that were perfectly predictable, the result of gravitational forces between the Earth and the Moon, and to a lesser extent, the Sun. But within those large patterns were smaller variations, local effects caused by the specific geography of the coastline, by the underwater topography, by the interaction of currents and waves. At high tide, the water rose to within 15 feet of the lighthouse foundation, would surge into the channels between the rocks, would fill the tide pools and cover the lowest ledges where seabirds rested. At low tide, the water retreated to reveal expanses of rock and sand that were usually hidden, would expose the full extent of the reef system that made these waters so dangerous to navigation, would create temporary islands and pathways that would vanish again in 6 hours when the tide returned. Elias began to time his inspections to coincide with different stages of the tide, wanting to observe how the presence manifested at different water levels. He found that it was most easily sensed at high tide, when the water was closest to the lighthouse, when the boundary between sea and land was at its most tenuous. During these times, especially when fog rolled in with the rising water, the presence felt immediate, almost tangible, as if it had concentrated itself in the water that surged around the lighthouse foundation, as if it was using the tide to bring itself as close to Elias as the physical constraints of its existence allowed. His garden demanded attention during the growing season. The plot was small, sheltered behind a stone wall that provided some protection from the salt spray and the constant wind. He grew potatoes primarily, along with turnips, onions, and a few hardy herbs. The soil was thin and rocky, and coaxing anything to grow required constant effort and attention. But Elias found satisfaction in the work, in the way it connected him to cycles of growth and harvest that were different from but complementary to the cycles of light and tide that governed the lighthouse. Digging in the soil, pulling weeds, watering from the rain barrels he maintained, Elias would feel the presence observing these activities as well. It seemed interested, in its alien way, in this process of cultivation, this human attempt to impose order and productivity on a small patch of inhospitable ground. The presence knew growth, knew the cycles of life and death that characterized biological existence, but from a perspective so vast and so detached that individual plants must have been beneath its normal attention. But now, because Elias tended them, because they were part of his daily routine, they became worthy of notice, became part of the ongoing observation that the presence maintained. Afternoons were often devoted to maintenance tasks. There was always something that needed repair or adjustment. The clockwork mechanism required regular servicing, its gears needing to be cleaned and oiled, its chains inspected for wear. The fog signal's compressor needed attention. The rain gutters needed to be cleared of the debris that accumulated there. The walls needed periodic patching where the mortar had eroded. The wood of the dock needed to be treated against rot. The list was endless, and Elias worked through it systematically, keeping notes of what had been done and what still needed doing, maintaining the lighthouse as carefully as he maintained the light itself. These tasks had always been meditative for Elias, a way of occupying his hands and quieting his mind, allowing thoughts to arise and pass without forcing them. But now they acquired an additional dimension. As he worked, as his hands performed the familiar motions of repair and maintenance, he felt as though he was being taught something. though what exactly he was learning remained unclear. The presence seemed to approve of this maintenance, this care for the lighthouse, this refusal to let entropy and decay have their way. It resonated with something in the presence's own nature, with its long vigil over these shores, with its own role as a kind of guardian, watching and preserving in its own way the memory of everything that had happened here. The supply boat came monthly, weather permitting. Its arrival was always an event, breaking the routine, bringing contact with the world beyond the lighthouse. The boat would tie up at the dock during high tide, and the crew would unload supplies, oil for the lamp, coal for the stove, food stores, mail if there was any, occasional equipment or repair materials. The crew never stayed long, an hour at most, and they regarded Elias with a mixture of respect and incomprehension. They could not understand why anyone would choose this isolation, this separation from ordinary human society. Elias had long since stopped trying to explain, but he noticed during the boat's visits that the presence withdrew somewhat, became less immediately perceivable. It was still there. He was always aware of it now at some level, but it pulled back, gave him space for this human interaction, this brief connection to the world of towns and commerce and the ordinary concerns of people who did not keep lighthouse vigils on remote headlands. It was only after the boat had departed, after the sound of its engine had faded into the distance, after Elias had returned to his routines, that the presence would come close again, would resume its observation with renewed intensity, as if it too had missed this connection during the brief interruption. Evenings were when Elias lit the lamp, beginning the cycle that would continue through the night. The ritual of lighting had become something more than procedure, more than habit. It had become a kind of communion, a daily offering made to the darkness and the deep, a gift of light that was acknowledged and appreciated by the ancient consciousness that watched from the water. As the sun approached the horizon, as the sky began its transition from day colors to night colors, Elias would climb the stairs one more time, 112 steps, his knees protesting now, his breathing harder than it had been in his younger years, but still steady, still reliable. He would reach the lantern room, would perform his checks, would prepare the lamp, and then, with the precision of long practice, he would bring the flame to the wick and watch as the light bloomed in the gathering darkness. The moment of lighting was when he felt the presence most strongly, as the Fresnel lens caught the lamplight and transformed it, as the beam began its sweep across the water. Elias could sense a response from the deep, a recognition, an acknowledgement that the light had returned for another night, that the old keeper had maintained his vigil, that the boundary between darkness and illumination was being marked once more. It was not a response that could be put into words, but it was unmistakable nonetheless. The presence knew when the light came on. It paid attention. It cared, in whatever way such a consciousness could care. Through the night, Elias would make his rounds, would climb the stairs every 2 hours to wind the clockwork, would check the lamp, would stand at the windows and look out into the darkness and the fog. During these night watches, the presence was always close. The fog seemed almost alive on these nights, seemed to press against the windows with an intelligence behind it, seemed to watch the light with the same intensity that the light watched the fog. Elias began to speak during these watches, quietly, not expecting answers but finding comfort in the words. "Still burning," he would say, standing at the windows. "Still watching." Simple statements, confirmations of fact, but also something more, the acknowledgement that the watching was shared, that the vigil was maintained by more than one consciousness, that the light served purposes beyond the merely practical. The changing seasons brought their own variations to the rhythm. Summer's longer days meant fewer hours of darkness, less time when the light was needed, but also more time for maintenance and repair. Winter's long nights meant more time in the lantern room, more climbs up the stairs, more hours spent in the cold, watching the beam cut through darkness and storm. But through all seasons, the presence remained constant, unchanged by weather or temperature, affected only by the fog which seemed to be its preferred medium, its way of making itself more perceptible to human awareness. There were nights when storms came, when the wind reached velocities that made the lighthouse sway on its foundation, when waves crashed against the rocks with force that shook the tower, when rain and spray obscured everything beyond the windows. During these storms, Elias would remain in the lantern room, unwilling to risk the stairs in the tower's violent motion, watching his light continue its sweep, maintaining its rhythm despite the chaos of wind and water. And during these storms, he felt the presence most intensely of all, felt it in the very fury of the elements, as if the storm itself was a manifestation of the ancient consciousness, as if what he had been interpreting as observation from the depths was actually something more fundamental, more integrated into the basic processes of weather and sea. During the worst storms, when the tower shook and the wind howled and the waves crashed so high that spray reached the lantern room 78 feet above the normal sea level, Elias would press his hand against the glass and feel the presence pressing back, feel a connection that transcended the physical barrier between inside and outside, between air and water, between human consciousness and whatever vast awareness dwelt in the storm and the deep. These were moments of strange peace despite the violence surrounding him. Elias felt safer during the great storms than he did on calm, clear days. The storms were when the presence was most clearly manifested, most undeniably real. The storms were when he felt most completely part of something larger than himself, most fully integrated into the systems and cycles that had existed long before he was born, and would continue long after he died. He found himself thinking less about his past as the months passed, less about Catherine and his earlier life, less about the choices that had brought him to this place. The present became more absorbing, more complete. Each day was sufficient unto itself, requiring no reference to what came before or what might come after. He existed in a perpetual now, in the immediate moment of whatever task demanded his attention, while simultaneously existing in a much vaster sense of time, in the awareness that his daily routines were part of cycles that measured out not human lifetimes, but geological epochs. His body was aging, growing frailer, and Elias was aware of this with the same calm attention he brought to maintaining the lighthouse. He noted the increasing pain in his joints, the way his hands trembled slightly when he tried to perform delicate tasks, the shortness of breath that accompanied his climbs up the stairs. He knew he would not be able to continue this work indefinitely. There would come a time, perhaps soon, when the Northern Lighthouse Board would send someone to evaluate his fitness for duty, would determine that he needed to be replaced by a younger keeper, would end his vigil whether he wished it to end or not. But until that time came, he would continue. He would maintain the light. He would keep his watch, and he would do so not alone, but in communion with the ancient presence that had revealed itself to him, that had chosen him for reasons he did not understand and did not need to understand, that had made his final years as a keeper rich with meaning and connection in ways he had never anticipated. The rhythm of days continued, each one similar to the last, each one unique in small details, each one part of the vast pattern that connected past to present to future. Wake, climb, wind, polish, watch, tend the garden, repair the equipment, record the weather, watch the tides, light the lamp, climb through the night, maintain the beam, watch the darkness and the fog, and through it all, the presence, watching, observing, acknowledging, maintaining its own vigil alongside his, creating through their parallel attention something that neither could have created alone. Night observations and the language of light. The deepest understanding between Elias and the presence came during the night watches, those hours of darkness when the lighthouse beam was not just a navigational aid, but a form of communication, a message sent into the void that was received and understood by something that dwelt in that void. Elias had always known that different lights spoke different languages. Each lighthouse had its characteristic pattern, its signature of flashes and eclipses that identified it uniquely. The Stornock Point light flashed every 10 seconds, a pattern that mariners learned to recognize, that told them exactly where they were in relation to the coast. But he had come to understand that this pattern meant something else as well, that it was being read by the presence in ways that had nothing to do with navigation, that each flash was noticed, counted, acknowledged. On a night in early November, with fog so thick that visibility extended no more than 20 feet from the lighthouse, Elias stood at the windows of the lantern room and experimented with something he had been thinking about for weeks. He waited until the scheduled flash cycle, then deliberately interrupted it, covering one of the lens faces with his hand for a single revolution, blocking the beam for one 10-second interval before allowing the normal pattern to resume. The response was immediate and unmistakable. The fog outside the windows seemed to press closer, seemed to pulse with sudden attention. Elias felt a surge of presence or a sudden intensification of the awareness that had become his constant companion. It was as if the presence had been startled, had recognized that the pattern had changed, had understood that the change was deliberate, that the keeper was trying to communicate something beyond the regular rhythm of the light. Elias restored the normal pattern, letting the beam sweep uninterrupted through its cycle. He felt the presence settle somewhat, though it remained more intense, more focused than it had been before his interruption. He waited for 10 minutes, 20, half an hour, letting the regular pattern reassert itself, letting the presence understand that the interruption had been temporary, that the light would continue its faithful service to passing ships. Then he did it again, another deliberate interruption, another single flash blocked by his hand covering the lens. And again the response was immediate, that surge of attention, that intensification of awareness, that sense of being observed with sudden acuteness. Over the course of that night, Elias experimented with different patterns of interruption. Sometimes he would block 2 flashes in succession. Sometimes he would block every third flash for several cycles before returning to the normal pattern. He was careful never to maintain any irregular pattern for too long, never to risk confusing any ship that might be navigating these waters by his light. But he wanted to see if the presence could distinguish between different patterns, could understand that he was attempting communication rather than simply failing in his duties. The presence could. There was no doubt about it. Each different pattern produced a slightly different quality of response, a subtle variation in the intensity and character of the attention being paid. When Elias blocked 2 flashes in succession, the response felt almost like inquiry, like a question being asked. When he maintained a regular pattern of interruptions, every third flash, for instance, the response felt almost like recognition, like the presence had detected the rhythm within the irregularity and had understood it as intentional. Elias was exhilarated by this discovery. For the first time, he had found a way to actively communicate with the presence, rather than simply receiving its observation. The light was not just something he maintained for ships. It was a language, a medium through which messages could be sent of and understood. He did not know what messages he was sending exactly, did not know what the presence understood from his experiments with pattern and rhythm, but the fact of communication itself was profound. Over the following weeks, Elias refined his experiments. He learned to read the responses more carefully, to distinguish between different qualities of attention that the presence directed toward the light. He learned that certain patterns seemed to produce something like pleasure, if such a concept could apply to a consciousness so alien, while others produced responses that felt more neutral or even slightly discordant. He found that patterns based on natural rhythms worked best. Interruptions that matched the rhythm of waves breaking on the rocks below, or the timing of his own heartbeat, or the intervals between calls of seabirds, all produced responses that felt harmonious, that seemed to be recognized by the presence as meaningful. Random interruptions, by contrast, produced responses that felt confused or uncertain, as if the presence was searching for meaning in chaos and not finding it. Elias began to think of his experiments as a kind of conversation, though a conversation conducted in a language neither party fully understood. He would introduce a pattern through his interruptions of the light. The presence would respond through subtle changes in the fog, through the quality of its attention, through effects so slight that Elias was never entirely sure whether I was perceiving them or imagining them. Then Elias would modify the pattern, would introduce variations, would wait for the response. It was slow communication, if it could even be called communication. A single exchange might take hours. The meaning being exchanged was unclear, perhaps ultimately unknowable, but it was real. Elias was certain of that. He was engaging in dialogue with something ancient and vast, and even if the content of that dialogue remained mysterious, the fact of it was transformative. He began to notice that his dreams were changing. The dreams of depths and watching eyes that had begun when he first sensed the presence had evolved into something more structured, more detailed. He dreamed of seeing the lighthouse from below, from the perspective of something far beneath the surface, looking up through layers of water that filtered and refracted the light. He dreamed of geological time, of watching coastlines change and shift, of seeing ice advance and retreat, of observing the slow dance of continents across the face of the planet. Were these dreams his own, constructed by his sleeping mind trying to process his experiences? Or were they somehow shared, images transmitted from the presence to his unconscious? Elias did not know, and could not know. The boundary between his consciousness and the presence's awareness had become permeable in ways that made such questions unanswerable. Perhaps it did not matter. Perhaps the sharing was more important than determining what was shared or who was doing the sharing. On clear nights, which were rare but treasured, Elias would spend extra time in the lantern room, would watch the stars slowly wheel overhead while his beam swept across the water below. The stars had always fascinated him, those distant suns whose light took years or decades or centuries to reach his eyes, whose positions marked the slow precession of Earth's axis, whose patterns had guided mariners long before lighthouses existed. Now he wondered if the presence was aware of them, if its consciousness extended upward as well as outward, if it could sense the light from those distant stars falling into the sea, mixing with the light from his lamp in the vast electromagnetic spectrum that connected everything to everything else. The moon's phases became more significant to Elias's understanding of his dialogue with the presence. During the full moon, when the sea was bright with reflected light, the presence seemed more diffuse, more distributed, as if the natural light satisfied some need that made the lighthouse beam less central to its attention. During the new moon, when darkness was most complete, the presence seemed to concentrate around the lighthouse, seemed to focus on the beam with an intensity that bordered on hunger, as if the light was not just being observed, but somehow consumed, absorbed, taken into the vast awareness that dwelt in the water and the fog. Elias began to adjust his experimental patterns based on the lunar cycle, using simpler rhythms during the full moon and more complex ones during the new moon, and he found that this approach produced richer responses, as if he had stumbled upon a principle that matched something in the presence's own nature, some relationship between moonlight and darkness that his patterns could resonate with or reflect. There were nights when Elias felt he was on the verge of a breakthrough, moments when the communication seemed about to crystallize into something clear and unmistakable. During these moments, the presence would feel incredibly close, would seem to press against his consciousness as tangibly as the fog pressed against the windows. The boundaries between himself and the presence would seem to thin, would become almost transparent, and Elias would have the sensation of touching something vast, of his small human awareness making contact with an intelligence that operated on scales he could barely comprehend. But these moments never quite resolved into clear understanding. They would approach, would seem imminent, and then would recede, leaving Elias with a sense of having been close to something important, but not quite reaching it. He came to accept this as inevitable, as perhaps the natural limit of what communication between such different forms of consciousness could achieve. The presence was not human, and never would be. He could not fully understand it any more than it could fully understand him. But they could touch, could acknowledge each other, could share the vigil even if they could never fully share their perceptions or their understanding. The lighthouse beam swept across the water, through the fog, into the darkness, measuring out time in 10-second intervals, marking the boundary between the known and the unknown, between the lit and the unlit, between human consciousness struggling to communicate and ancient awareness attempting to respond. And in that sweep, in that rhythm, in that endless repetition of light and darkness, Elias found a meaning that sustained him through the long nights, a purpose that went beyond mere duty, a connection that made his isolation feel less like separation and more like participation in something vast and eternal. On particularly foggy nights, Elias would sometimes see shapes in the beam, shadows and suggestions of form that appeared at the very limit of the light's reach and vanished when he tried to focus on them. Were these manifestations of the presence attempts to create something visible, something perceivable, or were they optical illusions, tricks of light and fog, and the human brain's irrepressible need to find patterns and meaning in chaos? Elias decided it did not matter. Whether the shapes were real in some objective sense or constructed by his perception made no difference to their significance. They were part of the dialogue, part of the exchange between himself and the presence. They were evidence of the reaching out that happened in both directions, the keeper trying to perceive what watched him, the watcher trying to manifest in ways the keeper could perceive. The sound of the waves acquired new meaning during these night watches. Elias had always been aware of the rhythm of water against rock, had used that rhythm to gauge sea conditions, to predict storms, to understand the state of the tide. But now he listened more carefully, heard subtleties he had previously missed. The waves were not uniform. Each one had its own character, its own voice, and within the overall rhythm were patterns that seemed almost deliberate, sequences of larger and smaller waves that appeared not random but structured, as if the sea itself was speaking in a language of percussion and resonance. Was the presence manipulating the waves, creating these patterns intentionally? Or was Elias simply perceiving structure that had always been there? That was the natural result of complex hydrodynamics and the interference of multiple wave trains. Again, the question seemed less important than the perception itself. Elias was hearing something meaningful in the waves, was detecting patterns that corresponded to his experiments with the light, and whether those patterns were objectively present or subjectively constructed did not change their significance to his experience. The fog horn, which Elias activated during periods of poor visibility, became another element of this nighttime language. The horn's deep moan carried for miles across the water, warning ships of the dangerous coast, even when the light was invisible in the fog. Elias began to vary the intervals between activations slightly, never enough to compromise the horn's function as a warning signal, but enough to introduce small variations in rhythm, to create patterns within the required pattern. And the fog responded, or seemed to respond. Elias noticed that sometimes, after a particular sequence of horn blasts, the fog would thin slightly, would pull back from the windows just enough to improve visibility, would create temporary clearings through which his light could penetrate farther. Were these responses to the horn's patterns, or simply natural variations in fog density that Elias was interpreting as meaningful? The question haunted him, even as he continued his experiments, even as he refined his patterns and noted the responses in his journal, even as he became more and more convinced that something real was happening, that communication was occurring, even if its exact nature remained uncertain. Through the long winter nights, with darkness stretching from late afternoon until mid-morning, with storms battering the coast and fog lying thick on the water, Elias maintained his vigil and continued his experiments. The communication, if that's what it was, became more fluid, more intuitive. He no longer had to consciously plan his pattern interruptions. His hands would move to cover the lens at moments that felt right, creating rhythms that emerged from some deeper awareness, some connection to the presence that operated below the level of conscious thought. And through it all, the light continued its faithful service to mariners, continued to mark the dangerous coast, continued to guide ships safely past the rocks. Elias never compromised that function, never allowed his experiments to endanger the vessels that depended on his light. But within the constraints of his duty, within the requirements of his service, he had found space for something else, something personal, something profound, a conversation between human and other than human, between the temporary and the eternal, between an old man counting down his final years and a consciousness that measured time in epochs and ages. The lighthouse beam swept across the water. The fog pressed close. The waves beat their rhythm against ancient rocks. And in the darkness, in the deep, something vast and old and patient continued its watch, acknowledged the keeper's attempts at communication, responded in its own mysterious ways, maintained its vigil alongside his in the space between light and darkness, between the known and the unknowable, between ending and beginning, understanding and acceptance. As winter deepened and the year turned towards spring, Elias found himself approaching a kind of understanding, though it was an understanding that could not be put into words, that existed more as a feeling than a thought, more as a state of being than a piece of knowledge. He understood first that the presence was not waiting for anything. It was not watching the lighthouse in anticipation of some future event, was not observing him in hopes that he would do something specific or achieve some particular goal. Its watching was an end in itself, was simply what it did, what it had always done, what it would always do. The concept of purpose, so central to human activity, did not apply to the presence in any straightforward way. It existed and observed, and the existence and observation were sufficient unto themselves. This realization brought Elias a deep peace. He had worried, during the early days of sensing the presence, that he was being tested somehow, that his response to this awareness would be judged, that he might fail in some way to do whatever the presence required of him. But there was no test, no requirement, no possibility of failure. The presence simply was, and his response to it simply was, and both could exist alongside each other without need for evaluation or judgment. He understood, second, that the presence had no form in the way that living things had form, no body that could be pointed to and identified. It was distributed through the medium of water and air, was present in the electromagnetic fields that permeated space, was woven into the quantum fabric of reality itself. To ask where the presence was located was like asking where a wave was located. The question assumed a kind of discreteness that did not match the reality of the thing being questioned. This helped explain why Elias had never seen the presence directly, why it manifested only through subtle effects and suggestions, through the feeling of being watched rather than through any visible watcher. It had no eyes to see with, no ears to hear with, no discrete sensory organs of any kind. Yet it sensed, nonetheless, was aware of the lighthouse and the light, and the keeper who tended both. Its mode of perception was so fundamentally different from human perception that any attempt to describe it in human terms necessarily failed. He understood, third, that the presence's relationship to time was not linear in the way human experience of time was linear. For Elias, time moved from past through present to future in a relentless progression. Memory preserved the past imperfectly, and the future was uncertain, unknowable until it became present, and then immediately slipped into past. But the presence seemed to experience time differently, to hold past and present and future simultaneously in its awareness, to perceive patterns that extended across thousands or millions of years as easily as Elias perceived the pattern of waves breaking on rocks. This made the presence's interest in the lighthouse both more and less comprehensible. The lighthouse, which would stand for decades, or perhaps a century or two before succumbing to erosion and time, was an ephemeral thing from the presence's perspective, a brief flash of organized light in a span of time, otherwise measured in the slow movement of glaciers and continents. Yet that very brevity seemed to be part of what made it interesting, seemed to attract the presence's attention precisely because it was so different from the vast, slow processes that normally occupied its awareness. Elias thought often about what would happen when he died, when his body finally gave out and his vigil ended. The Northern Lighthouse Board would send another keeper, or perhaps would automate the light, would replace human tending with mechanical systems that required less maintenance and no permanent habitation. What would the presence make of that change? Would it continue to watch, to pay attention to the light even without a human consciousness to acknowledge its watching? He thought the answer was yes. The presence had been here before Elias, had watched previous keepers, had observed the lighthouse from its construction. It would watch after he was gone, would continue its vigil regardless of whether anyone was aware of that vigil or not. His acknowledgement of the presence, his attempts at communication, his understanding, these were gifts he gave to the presence, but they were not necessary to its existence or its purpose. The presence would continue whether he acknowledged it or not. And yet, his acknowledgement had mattered. Of that, Elias was certain. The presence had responded to his awareness in ways it had not responded to previous keepers who had remained oblivious to its existence. Something had been created by the meeting of these two forms of consciousness, by the recognition that flowed between them, by the attempts at communication through light and fog and subtle manipulations of natural patterns. What had been created could not be destroyed by Elias's death. It would persist in some form, would remain part of the presence's vast accumulation of experience, would be a memory, if something like the presence could be said to have memories. that would last for millennia to come. This thought comforted Elias more than any religious promise of personal immortality ever had. He would die, his consciousness would cease, but something of what he had experienced here, something of the connection he had forged, would continue. Not in heaven or any supernatural realm, but here, in this place, woven into the awareness of something that was as much a part of the natural world as rocks and water and light itself. He began to think of his time at Stornock Point, not as exile or isolation, but as a kind of privilege. How many humans, across all of history, had achieved genuine contact with something truly other, truly beyond the boundaries of human experience? Most people lived their entire lives within the comfortable confines of human understanding, interacting only with other humans and with the domesticated or familiar aspects of nature. But Elias had been granted something different, contact with a form of consciousness that was genuinely alien, that operated according to principles and patterns that human minds could barely glimpse, that represented a way of being in the world so foreign to human experience that even recognizing its existence required a kind of perceptual revolution. This privilege had not been earned, exactly, any more than his suffering the loss of Catherine had been deserved. It had simply happened, was the result of circumstances and choices and chance that had brought him to this place at this time in his life, that had prepared him to perceive what others had not perceived, to acknowledge what others had not known was there to be acknowledged. He felt gratitude, though he was not sure to whom or what that gratitude should be directed. To the Northern Lighthouse Board, for assigning him to this remote station, to Catherine, whose death had sent him seeking isolation in which he could grieve, to whatever forces had shaped the universe, such that consciousness could arise in forms as different as a human lighthouse keeper and an ancient presence distributed through water and stone. The question of where to direct gratitude seemed less important than the feeling itself, the sense of being blessed by circumstances despite their difficulty, despite the isolation and the loss and the physical deterioration of age. Spring brought longer days, milder weather, the return of migratory birds in their thousands. The cliffs came alive with nesting activity, with a constant clamor of birds tending eggs and chicks, with the chaos of life asserting itself against the backdrop of stone and sea. Elias watched this annual renewal with different eyes than he had in previous years, seeing in it a pattern that connected to the presence's awareness, recognizing that the cycles of biological life were part of what the presence had observed for millions of years, that the birds and fish and all the other creatures that moved through this ecosystem were part of the vast web of awareness that included both him and the watcher from the deep. His body was failing more noticeably now. The pain in his joints was constant, managed only partially by the liniments and poultices he prepared from the herbs in his garden. His hands shook more severely, making the delicate work of trimming wicks and cleaning lenses more difficult. His breathing was labored, especially after climbing the stairs, and he had to pause more frequently during his ascents, resting on the small landings, waiting for his heart to slow and his lungs to catch up to the demands he placed on them. He knew his time as keeper was approaching its end. The board would notice eventually, during one of the inspector's visits, that he was no longer fully capable of performing his duties. They would make arrangements for his retirement, would probably offer him a small pension, would thank him for his decades of service and gently but firmly remove him from the post he had held for so long. The thought brought sadness but not despair. He had lived a full life, had performed his duty faithfully, had been granted experiences that few humans ever achieved. If he had to leave this place, had to surrender his vigil to a younger keeper or to automated systems, he could do so, knowing that his time here had mattered, had meant something not just to the ships he had guided safely, but to the ancient consciousness that had shared his watch. He wondered sometimes what he would do in retirement, where he would go, how he would fill his days without the rhythm of lighthouse keeping to structure his time. But these wonderings were abstract, lacked urgency. The future beyond his time at Stornok Point seemed hazy, uncertain, perhaps not very long. He might have a few years in some cottage near a town, might reconnect with distant relatives, might find new routines and new purposes. Or he might die shortly after leaving, his body having held on this long only because the lighthouse required it, his consciousness fading once the urgent necessity of maintaining the light no longer animated him. Either way, he was at peace. He had done his work. He had kept his light. He had been acknowledged by something vast and ancient, had achieved a connection that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human experience. Whatever time remained to him, whether years or months or weeks, was extra, was grace, was a gift he had not earned, but would accept with gratitude. The lighthouse stood on its point of rock, white against the gray stone, solid against the erosion of wind and wave. The light turned in its glass room at the top of the tower, faithful and constant, marking the dangerous coast for any who sailed these waters. And Elias climbed his stairs, tended his lamp, maintained his vigil, knowing that he was part of something larger and more enduring than himself, something that connected him backward to all the keepers who had preceded him, and forward to all who would follow, and downward through water and stone to consciousness that had existed before any lighthouse was built, and would continue long after the last lighthouse crumbled into the sea. Closing and final reflections. The days lengthened as spring advanced toward summer. The fog still came, still pressed close around the lighthouse on most mornings and evenings, but it had a different quality now, lighter somehow, less oppressive, infused with hints of growth and warming and life returning to the northern latitudes. The birds were everywhere, their numbers almost incomprehensible, their noise a constant backdrop to every activity, their presence a reminder that life persisted, flourished, adapted, continued in the face of all the hardships that nature and the sea could impose. Elias continued his daily routines with the stubbornness of long habit, and the knowledge that these routines were numbered, that each might be among the last he would perform. He climbed the stairs more slowly now, pausing after every 20 steps to rest, to breathe, to let his protesting heart settle before continuing. He polished the lens with hands that shook more each day, had to be more careful not to drop the cloths or knock over the bottles of cleaning solution. He maintained his garden with an old man's patient determination, kneeling in the dirt for shorter periods, taking longer to rise, accepting that some tasks would take twice as long as they once had. The presence remained with him, constant in its attention, unchanged by the changing seasons or by Elias's declining physical capacity. If anything, it seemed closer than ever, as if sensing that the time of their connection was finite, that the old keeper would not be here much longer, that whatever communication had been established between them would soon end when Elias's consciousness ceased and took with it the human half of their strange dialogue. Or would it end? Elias had come to suspect that something of what had passed between himself and the presence would persist even after his death, that the presence would carry some trace of him, some memory or echo or pattern woven into its vast awareness, not in the way that humans remembered, with specific images and emotions and narratives, but in some other way, as a subtle alteration of the presence's structure, a change that would endure as long as the presence itself endured. The thought was both humbling and elevating. He would not be remembered by humans, most likely. He had no children to carry on his name, no great accomplishments that would be recorded in history books, no legacy in the usual human sense. But he would persist nonetheless, would continue as a pattern in the awareness of something that would outlast all human memory, all human records, all human civilization itself. It was a strange form of immortality, perhaps, but it was real, and it was his. On a morning in late May, with the sun actually visible through a temporary break in the clouds, with the sea reflecting light in shades of blue and green that seemed impossibly vivid after months of gray, Elias stood at the base of the lighthouse and looked up at the tower he had climbed tens of thousands of times over the past 3 decades. His body ached. His breath came short. He was tired in a way that went deeper than mere physical fatigue, tired in his bones, tired in his soul. But the light needed tending. Ships needed its guidance, and the presence was watching, waiting, expecting him to continue his vigil as he always had. So Elias began to climb, 1 step, then another, then another. 112 steps from bottom to top. 112 opportunities to give up, to admit defeat, to accept that he could no longer perform this duty. But he did not give up. Step by step, pause by pause, he climbed. By the time he reached the lantern room, he was shaking with exhaustion, was gasping for breath, felt as though his heart might burst from the strain. But he had made it. He had climbed the stairs 1 more time. He moved to the windows, pressed his forehead against the cool glass, and looked out at the sea and the sky and the distant line where they met. The presence was there, immediate and palpable, pressing close as if in recognition of what the climb had cost him, as if honoring the effort he had made to continue his duty despite the difficulty. Elias felt a wave of something that might have been gratitude flowing from the presence, or might have been his own emotion reflected back at him, or might have been something created by the interaction of his consciousness and the presence's awareness that belonged fully to neither. Still here, Elias whispered to the glass, to the sea, to the presence that watched from the water, still keeping the light. And in that moment, he understood that this was enough, that this had always been enough, that the simple act of maintaining the light, of performing his duty day after day, despite difficulty and isolation and loss, was itself a form of triumph, a victory over entropy and darkness and despair. He did not need to fully understand the presence to have value in his connection to it. He did not need to receive explicit acknowledgement or reward to know that his work mattered. The light burned. Ships passed safely, and something ancient bore witness to his faithfulness. Elias descended the stairs slowly, carefully, holding the rail with both hands, placing each foot deliberately on each step. He made it to the bottom without falling, without collapsing, though it took every bit of determination and stubbornness he possessed. He stumbled to his quarters, barely made it to his bed before exhaustion overwhelmed him, and he fell into a sleep that was deeper and more complete than any he had experienced in years. He dreamed of the sea, as he so often did now. But this time, the dream was different. He was not watching the sea from above, but was in it, was part of it, was the sea. He felt the currents moving through him, felt the waves as expressions of his own energy, felt the fog as his breath rising from his surface. And when morning came, it came gently. The light still turned above the rocks. The sea still breathed against the shore. And somewhere deep beneath the water and the fog, the ancient watcher remained, quiet, patient, eternal. If you are listening to my story now, then you have kept this vigil with me. You have sat beside the light. You have listened to the waves. You have shared the silence. For that, I thank you, not as a keeper to a passer-by, but as one watcher speaking to another. May your rest tonight be deep and untroubled. May the darkness feel safe. May the slow rhythm of the sea carry your thoughts away, one by one, until only stillness remains. The light is burning. The watch is kept. You are not alone. Sleep now. I will remain here a little while longer.